Hello, Internet. Evan Benton of Dogg from Air here with another book report. Today's title is The Persecuted Drug, the story of DMSO. And this book was written by, Pat McGrady Sr., MD, in the year 1973. So I heard about DMSO as a massage therapist, kind of just an alternative thingy that you hear about. Back in massage school, my teachers just told me it was, they said it was like big in the 70s and you could only use it on animals today for some reason. But it was just a pain reliever and it smelled like garlic, and some people swore by it. So I never really been athletic myself, so I've never really had a lot of occasion to use products like this. So I kind of forgot about it until very recently. I was talking to a client of mine about disulfiram, which is the experimental Lyme disease treatment, and he was actually a toxicologist for the CDC, so he knew what I was talking about, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's one of those things like DMSO that they were studying for a while that had a lot of, potential, but nothing ever came of them." So that piqued my interest, and since she has so many aches and pains, I thought, hey, why not? So got a bottle at the local feed store, so it's not approved for use on on humans. You can only get it for use on animals. So this is the gel, and it's also available just in a pure liquid, and it's available in a roll-on applicator. It's kind of funny. You can read what it says on the back. Not approved for human use. Caution: eye irritant. Blah blah blah. Avoid contact with skin. And then it says non-toxic. If swallowed, do not induce vomiting. So it's just kind of funny. What do you do with it? You can't swallow it. You can't put it on your skin. It's just to put it on a shelf there. That's just how they get around the legality of it. It's like when you buy unpasteurized milk for your dog or something like that. All right, so we've been using on it. She's got a leg that hurts. It seems to help. I use it on some like acne that I often get, and it seems to increase it seems to dry it up, and it seems to heal faster. Anything kind of seems to heal faster when you use it on it. And that's kind of what it's for, I guess. Well, one of the things it's for. It's an interesting compound. I'll get into that a little more. Cuts, burns, anything like that. You just put a little on. And then this is the 99%, so it's good to water it down because it does cause skin irritation. It will kind of like dry the skin off and make it look like, after you spend too much time in the bathtub, and then your skin will kind of slough off. But it's not. It sounds worse than it is. It's a good idea though to water it down. So I just use like an aloe gel to mix with this to dilute it to like 70% is what the book says. But this book doesn't really have a lot of how to in it. There's other books for that. Anyway, and when you dilute it, it gets hot, which I looked up is called the Heat of Dilution. It sounds like witchcraft to me, but there's a Wikipedia article on it. So there you go. And it smells bad. It smells like, I heard that it smells like garlic, and no, it smells like garlic. It smells exactly like fresh cut garlic, which is really weird. And it doesn't smell like anything in the bottle. Well, kind of. It just really reeks when you get it on your skin. And they even say that when you put it on your skin, like on your arm, it can come out of your breath. And for the sake of science, I did try drinking some yesterday because they say they used it for like a cavities and gingivitis as another. It just kind of helps you heal again there. And it got warm in my mouth. That was really weird. It didn't burn or anything though. It's not gonna boil. It tastes awful. It's one of the most bitter things I've ever had in my mouth. And it lasts for a long time. It's very unpleasant. So probably no one's gonna do that. This is not medical advice, I have to say, by the way. Probably got that already. So anyway, on to the book. In 1961, a chemist named Robert J. Herschler, Herschler, and a surgeon named Stanley Jacob discovered that this stuff, DMSO, which stands for dimethyl sulfoxide, enabled various chemicals to more easily penetrate plant and animal tissue. It was a joint effort between Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, Oregon, and the Crown-Zellerbach Company, which is a paper company. And so the chemical was first synthesized in 1866 by a Russian chemist named Alexander Zaitsev as a byproduct of the paper-making industry. So that's why they were working on it. It was a cooperative effort between this paper company and OHSU Medical Research Hospital, trying to find uses for these various compounds that they had more than they knew what to do with. So in the course of their studies, it indicated promise as an analgesic, a topical pain reliever, an anti-inflammatory, an antioxidant, an antimicrobial. They found that it regrew your hair very slowly. It had some anti-cancer potential, and it was also a cryoprotectant, so they could use it as like an antifreeze for organ transplants and things like that. And then just what it would do is if you mix things with it, it would make it so they could penetrate the skin more easily. So in some cases, they could even mix it with the DMSO and then rub it on your skin, and it would penetrate directly into your skin, so you wouldn't need an injection. So it opened up some new pathways for administration of different drugs. Of course, that also presents basically the only risk of DMSO, which is if you mix it with a toxin, it can make the toxin more potent. So you have to watch out, and you have to watch out for what things you might inadvertently mix it with. If you take it with something toxic, not realizing it, or if you're exposed to something toxic without realizing it, it could be bad. So watch out for that. Always ask your doctor. Don't listen to me. Anyway, in 1963, OHSU and Crown-Zellerbach, then they filed a patent for the treatment patent it for use as a medication. They filed several patents because actually this thing has so many applications, and the press got hold of that because a patent application is public information. So the press found this patent application they had written, and it was like a wonder drug, and the press they basically ran with it, and they published this story of how great it was, and without the scientists' approval, and basically everyone got pissed at the scientists because they said you went to the press already before you had gone through the scientific journal process, the peer review process, and they thought he was they said they thought he was a glory hog, and the FDA thought that, well, they wanted to put the kibosh on that. And so according to this book, according to the book here, the whole reason that DMSO is not a household name today is just because this Dr. Jacob didn't follow the rules, and he went to the press. So some of that's definitely true. The other reasons why DMSO is not a household name is that it's just cheap. It's basically a otherwise worthless byproduct of the paper industry. So it's it's basically free. This was I think this was like $12 for this bottle, but for 8 ounces. But that's like the book says it's like 35 cents a gallon to make. I don't know. Anyway, it's really cheap, and and they say that's why the pharmaceutical companies want nothing to do with it, because it's so cheap, and they want to push these $1,000 a dose medications on you. So possibly, that makes sense as well. And the fact that it's such a wide-ranging drug, that so many applications listed on the patent application, the bureaucratic process just didn't know what to do with it. So when you go to the FDA, you try to get approval, you have to say like it's a pain reliever, it's a antifungal, blah blah blah. These are all different departments that you have to go through approval for. So that the book says that's another reason why it didn't get accepted. And then another thing is the thalidomide debacle, which, if you know anything about that, thalidomide was I don't even know what it was for, but they gave it to pregnant women, and it caused terrible birth defects in their children. And so the FDA was on the right side of that one. They banned thalidomide in 1961, and a lot of people at the FDA, that move made their career. And so this book alleges that the people involved with banning DMSO are looking for a similar home run for their career. Again, it's possible. It makes sense. So that was 1961, thalidomide, and we're into 1963 now with the patent application. And so in 1964, Dr. Jacob and his colleagues finally got around to having some papers published on the subject of DMSO. And similar to the patent, the papers they went too far in the eyes of many of his other colleagues. So that, they thought this was just preposterous that this drug could have so many positive, positive effects. I guess I didn't really go into how good this is. I mean, because I don't have arthritis, or anything like that. But people were legitimately saying it was like a wonder cure. Like they would take and just rub a little bit of this on their skin, and 30 minutes later, the pain would be gone. It causes like itching and things like that. But for a lot of people with like back pain, arthritis, shoulder pain, muscle and joint pain, this was a miracle drug. It really was. So I'm sorry, I'm not really getting into that side of it. I'm trying to just talk about more the history of its application process and how wonky that was. So he published these papers. These doctors published these papers, and they basically stopped getting invited to all the cool parties, and people stopped talking to them. But meanwhile, around the country and around the world, other doctors that had seen the press, the description of a miracle drug, did start using it on patients, and they did apply for licenses with the FDA to study the drug, to prescribe it for patients experimentally. Those are called investigational new drug permits or certifications, something like that. And they went and did that, and they were getting results. And for this period of time, it was very promising. Patients were talking, they were just talking about how great it was. There was absolutely no side effects. They were doing animal studies this whole time, and they were finding very low toxicity for this thing. And everything was going great, except for the scientists who were butthurt no other way to say it about the process. Up until 1965, when a patient in Ireland was prescribed DMSO and died. And there's, as far as I can tell from the book, major problems with her death being attributed to DMSO. But so they said it was an allergic reaction to DMSO, and it was published in the Wall Street Journal of all places. So the book says that the FDA was responsible for that, for getting it put into the Wall Street Journal. But a quote from the article then is, whether the woman actually took the drug is unknown. So she was taking all these other medications. She was prescribed DMSO, I guess, right before her death. And they attributed her death to DMSO then. It sounds a little familiar, if you know what I mean. But yeah, that was the beginning of the end. So they cracked down on DMSO research at that time. The FDA did. They said, no more of that. 7 weeks later, they completely halted all research into DMSO. They were telling people that you would go blind if you took DMSO, which they did find some evidence that in certain species it caused a clouding of the lens of the eye. But they found that that was, I think, only in dogs, and they found that in monkeys there was no such effect. But based on that, that was what you would hear, is that, well, you'll go blind. So in short order, 2 FDA agents showed up at Dr. Jacobs' office, the doctor who originally discovered these effects of DMSO, and they started copying all of his records. And it started out fine. He said, yes, that's fine. And he left for lunch or something. He came back, and they were photocopying things they shouldn't have been photocopying. They were photocopying his confidential patient records, and they were even photocopying his private correspondences. And he got angry, as you would, and told him to leave. And eventually he got a lawyer involved and started suing the FDA because what they were doing was wrong. And in response to that, the FDA basically doubled down on their claims that the DMSO was this terrible scourge, and they essentially they leaked out all these articles to the press, or they had their friends in the press publish all these articles about how terrible DMSO was, and so on and so forth. So they were using the press to, they weren't doing this. They weren't fighting DMSO through science because there was no science. They were just trying to make it look bad in the press. And so then in response to this, some scientists got together, organized a conference in New York City where they were talking about how promising DMSO looked as a potential drug. And that was followed by a conference in Vienna where Germany announced that they were going to start selling DMSO as a prescription drug. But even though the FDA had no jurisdiction in foreign countries, they ended up not having very many sales for the legal DMSO in Germany, and they said that it was just because there was the influence from the American medical community on the German medical community made it seem like it wasn't a good thing. So DMSO stopped gradually being produced. It was legal in more and more countries overseas, but they stopped producing it. It was not being studied at all in the United States, and it was just kind of a back and forth, trying to study it in not clandestine, you know what I mean. Some scientists were studying it, but it was very, very difficult. There were a few political efforts to get it reinstated, trying to legalize it in certain states that were ineffective, and on and on and on. A lot of the book deals with this. That's why I'm just trying to gloss over it. At any rate, in 1970, those original patent applications for 1962 1963 were finally approved. So the FDA was not allowing use of the drug, but the United States Patent Office had approved the patents. So there's a strange little bit of bureaucratic strangeness happening there. It was, and that's the history of that. It's confusing. Sorry about that. And to be honest, I don't, even having read the book, I'm not really sure what the current legality of the drug is. So I have it here, but I bought this for animal purposes, and it's, as I said, it says not to be swallowed, not to be used on your skin. That doesn't leave a whole lot, So it's just an example where they didn't actually make it illegal. They just put it into this permanent, what's the word? The purgatory, right? Yeah, I don't know. Purgatory of regulation. I did find that it's legal in 8 states. Doctors can prescribe it in 8 states, and those states are Florida, Louisiana, Montana, Nevada, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, and Washington. So go figure, the state where they actually study it, it's legal. That's cool. Louisiana is actually also where they had the only mill or whatever factory that produced it. So it's legal there. That's about it though for the history of that. This book is cool because it has a nice little appendix at the back with some research. So I'm just going to go and read the headlines or the topics for what they said there was some good data on, okay? Things that it's good for. Arthritis, athletic injuries, of course, pain in general, wound healing, I mentioned that at the beginning, plastic surgery, ear trouble, that's really interesting, ear surgery, periodontal disease, so that was why I switched it around in my mouth. Whew, it must be good for you the way it tastes, lordy. Teeth again, fungal infection, ringworm, psoriasis. I think it actually said it's not effective against psoriasis though. Dermatology. Oh, there's a whole little section on dermatology. Scleroderma, one of the few things that it's been very effective for. There's a big long thing here on scleroderma. Shingles and DNA virus infections. Friend leukemia virus. A couple of different viruses there. And tumors. Just in general. What else? Interstitial cystitis. Ah, yes. This is the one condition that DMSO was approved for by the FDA back in those heady times. Urinary calculi, bladder stones, I guess. Amyloidosis, tuberculosis, rhinoscleroma. It's where you get like a bacterial infection of your nose that moves down your respiratory tract. Diabetes, Parkinson's disease, nerve regeneration, stroke, very interesting study there. Spinal cord trauma, that's healing again. Coma, heart disease, it's a protective, against your heart, against heart damage in various conditions. Thyroid depression, all this crazy stuff. Cataract prevention, in contrast to what they claimed about the eyes, or hurting your eyes. There's some evidence that it's actually helpful in preventing that. It's a radiation protective, and then it's effective in mental retardation, improving the performance of children with mental retardation. True story. I don't know how it works, but they studied children with Down syndrome in, I think, South America, and they got a little bit smarter. So I'm going to get into just a little bit on the FDA, because I know that's what everyone wants me to hear about, or wants me to talk about. And I'm going to just read from this book a tiny little excerpt. Richard D. Lyons reported in a series of 3 articles beginning in the New York Times of March 14th, 1977, that the FDA within the last 10 years evolved from, quote, amorphous obscurity deep within the capital bureaucracy into both the world's paramount regulator of consumer goods and the federal government's most criticized, demoralized, and fractionalized agency. So this is 1977, so this must be from a later edition of this book. Among the points made by Lyons were these. Top FDA positions remained unfilled for long periods, and the leaderless departments drift and founder. Within the last 3 years, the FDA was subject to more than 100 congressional investigations, 50 highly critical reports by the General Accounting Office, a series of internal investigations by FDA staff committees. Employees complained before congressional committees about their superiors, thus inviting more harassment, intimidation, and reversals of their official findings on specific foods and drugs. Special interest lobbies went to Congress and contacts in the White House to have FDA decisions overturned, while new drugs piled up, new foods with new additives went on the market, and new devices stagnated in an enormous backlog. Under these conditions, what could the frustrated employees do? Dr. J. Richard Kraut, director of the Bureau of Drugs, once told a congressional committee that in the FDA where there was drunkenness, absenteeism, fights in the enormous documents room, and spitball throwing. Members of the professional staff were called, quote, retreads and, quote, has-beens, he said. Division directors and their staffs engaged in, quote, a kind of behavior that invited subordination, Kraut said. He added, people littering in corners, throwing spitballs. I'm describing physicians, he said. People who would, let me say, slouch down in a chair, not responding to questions, moan and groan with sweeping gestures, a kind of behavior I have not seen in any other institution as a grown man. End quote. It is not as though nice things are never said about the FDA. For the life of me, however, I cannot recall hearing anyone with a good word who was not in the employ of the FDA. Sherwin Gardner, the outgoing acting commissioner of Food and Drugs, was one of these. In a letter to the Times, he took issue with Lyons' article and an editorial, Nobody Loves the FDA. Gardner pointed out that the relatively small FDA, with a staff of 7,000, triple what it had been 15 years ago, so that would be 62 to 77, who's talking here, and a budget of $253 million, a tenfold increase in 15 years, is expected to regulate a $200 billion product manufactured and distributed by 100,000 firms. He contended that the FDA was not demoralized. There are some dissatisfied employees, he said, that condition is bound to exist in such a complex organization. The conclusion that nobody loves the FDA is a bit disconcerting, but is probably on occasion true. So, to the topic of corruption, yada yada yada. I mean, we all know that. So that's why I'm not gonna get really into it. But the book is good for that. It kind of goes on and on. So I'm trying to give you a very shortened version of it. But it just kind of says like this all just happened because of just corruption and blah blah blah. Which I said is reasonable, but I'm putting on my conspiracy cap, and I'm thinking there's more to the story here. So to support that, I'm going to talk about the 3 directors who were in charge of the FDA during the time that the DMSO development process was going on. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. So the first was James L. Goddard, 1966 to 68. He was in the U.S. Army during World War II. He got his MD from George Washington University, and then he was a doctor for only 14 months before he went into the Public Health Service, working for the United States government. And then he was the director of the CDC from 1962 until 66 when he transferred over to the FDA. And the book doesn't mention that, which is interesting. I don't know if the CDC wasn't such a big deal back in 1973 when this book was written, but anyway, that's where he was. He was the director of the CDC before he moved over to the FDA. And then after he retired, as they do, he went into private consulting for the healthcare industry. And the New York Times obituary of him for him reported that from 1970 to 1972, he, quote, directed the Ford Foundation's family planning program in India. So that connects very closely with Bill Gates and his stuff, which we're looking at and learning all about right now since we're all on lockdown. During his tenure, the FDA hired its first armed agents, according to this book. So that's interesting. Next, we had Herbert L. Lay Jr., who was the FDA for only 18 months from 1968 to the middle of 1969. He was also in the U.S. Army during World War II. And then after that, he worked at Walter Reed. He got his MD from Harvard in 1946. Then he went to the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where he studied, rickettsial diseases. So those are tick-borne diseases, which ties into some of my other research. So he before he got into his FDA job, he was the chairman of the Department of Bacteriology, Hygiene, and Preventive Medicine at George Washington University. So that's another tie that he has with the previous fellow. Oh, and he was an epidemiologist in Korea and Vietnam. So he was working for the U.S. government there, studying diseases there, those two countries. And he instigated something called the Kinslow Report, which was like an internal committee to assess the workings of the FDA. And it found that the FDA was just not doing its job basically in any way, shape, or form. So he was kind of a reformer. And maybe because of this, he was on what Wikipedia calls, Richard Nixon's life very much, but he was on what Wikipedia calls the master list of Nixon's political opponents. So he wasn't one of the 20, but he was in the top. There was like another 100 people that, of course, when Richard Nixon came to power, his advisors said, you got to get rid of all these people, and that's what happened. That's why he was forced to leave the agency, and he went and became a consultant again, which is what you do. He's got a great quote that he gave to the New York Times on his departure, which is also in the book. I'm going to read it here. The thing that bugs me is that people think the FDA is protecting them. It isn't. What the FDA is doing and what people think it's doing are as different as night and day. So that is a former director of the FDA telling you about the FDA. So I just don't feel the need to really go into depth with the corruption, etc., with some of these agencies. When their directors are saying things like that in the New York Times. And then the last one, Charles C. Edwards, he's another doctor. He was under Nixon and then Ford, so 1969 to 1973. He was United States Marine Corps during the Korean War. He got his master's of surgery from the University of Minnesota, and he worked at the Mayo Clinic. Then he was the vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a management consulting firm, which I don't know what management consulting firms do. They manage, they're outside managers. It seems like a ridiculous concept. I know they're huge though. I know they make tons of money. He was the only one who kept on in the government after his brief tenure at the FDA. He went on to become the Assistant Secretary for Health. And then after that, he went on to consulting. And the main place he worked at that I found was the Scripps Research Institute. I don't know a whole lot about them, but they have a lot of ties to everything you'd expect them to have ties to. I'm just mentioning that in case anyone else wants to do that research. All right. And so the thing about these guys, so they're all military, right? And they all have ties to just big East Coast universities. Charles Edwards went to Princeton, but then he got his. I don't know how. I thought surgeons were doctors, but he has said he has a master's in surgery, and of course Mayo Clinic's very prestigious. So anyway, they're all from the same kind of Ivy League / military backgrounds. And the thing that I think is curious is that the author of this book actually interviewed the first two and requested to interview the last one. And on the subject of DMSO, he noted that they didn't really know what he was talking about. So they weren't familiar with the research on DMSO enough to counter any of his claims. And that tells me that they didn't have any particular interest in DMSO for any particular reason as to safety or anything. And I think that they were just, someone above them then was telling them to squash DMSO. So that's the story with DMSO in my conspiracy theorist opinion. And the third one, he said when he got that request to interview the author, he said, well, I'm not going to tell you anything the other two didn't. So no. So at least he was honest. But so basically three of them said the same thing, and they all indicated that they didn't know anything about the drug that he was even trying to talk to them about. So again, for some reason, the heads of the FDA, and maybe it's still going on today, were told, don't let anybody research this drug. So most people are probably going to say, well, it's cancer. It's the cancer cure. And, and that's reasonable, I guess. But there's just a lot of cancer cures. It doesn't seem, there's a lot of things that seem promising for cancer, so I don't think they would they do all get squashed. But the little note about the cryoprotective, this is crazy, but, in my little conspiracy theorist brain, this is what I think is going on. I think that, keep in mind this has been studied, or it's been known about since 1866, so they got a whole 100-year head start. The Deep State Breakaway Society, black budget people, they got a whole 100-year head start on us. And I think that the DMSO is being used in their cryogenics program. So like possibly, freezing people's heads, freezing people's entire bodies. Because what it does, they use this in like blood transplants. They use this in organ transplants, and it's a solution of DMSO with whatever kind of buffer, and it makes it so when you freeze the blood, it doesn't form the ice crystals that cause the damage to the blood or to the organ, that make it so that when you bring it back up to room temperature, it's just goo. So it is an antifreeze. It's an antifreeze, but it's a non-toxic antifreeze. So it's an antifreeze they can use in human cells without damaging them. He talks about how they use that in frostbite. Extreme cases of frostbite where they thought they were going to have to amputate. They ended up just rubbing the person's fingers and toes and even up to their knees with DMSO. And they made a full recovery. So it's basically, again, kind of miraculous there. Don't take my word for it. Don't go and get frostbite and test it out, But also we know they were studying frostbite in World War II. The Nazi fellows were doing that. So that's just my crazy speculation, and I hope you'll still be my friends. So yeah, I'm not gonna go into any more depth in anything like that. If you want to know more about the FDA and how zany and kooky it is, the book gives me 2 sources to share with you, and these are 1970 sources, so they're probably still good, but the first is called The Dictocrats, Our Unelected Rulers by Omar V. Garrison, and the second is The Chemical Feast by James S. Turner, and that's published by Ralph Nader Study Group. We all know who Ralph Nader is. So that is it, and I hope you like that. Check out the book if you're interested in alternative medication and stuff like that, medicine. And it kind of tells you how to treat people. I'm not going to tell you how to treat people because I don't tell people how to treat people. It's not what I do. So don't do anything. Don't think that anything in this video is giving you advice or anything like that. There's plenty of books on the subject, but do consult a doctor if you're thinking about using that on yourself or any of your loved ones or anyone, even people you don't like. Talk to a doctor first. This has been Evan Benton of Dogg for Mayor. Thank you and have a pleasant evening.